There's a moment in history that most of us have never heard of, a single day when the course of an entire continent shifted forever, and yet it remains buried in the footnotes of time. Picture this: on a spring morning in 1434, two armies faced each other across a field in Bohemia, not as strangers, but as brothers who had fought side by side for years, now divided by ideology and ambition. One soldier, whose name is lost to us, wrote in his diary just hours before the fighting began, "We march not against foreigners, but against our own dreams." What we win today, we may lose forever. That haunting sentiment captures the profound tragedy and significance of the Battle of Lipany, a confrontation so pivotal that it redirected the flow of European history, yet remains startlingly absent from popular memory. Why does this matter to us today? Because the echoes of that day are still with us in the borders of nations, the structure of power, and the very ideas that shape our world. The Battle of Lipany didn't just end a war, it extinguished the most radical religious revolution of its time, dismantled a movement that had terrified kings and popes, and made possible the rise of empires that would dominate Europe for centuries. It was a clash between idealism and pragmatism, between revolution and reconciliation, and its outcome determined whether Europe would continue fracturing into religious chaos or find a precarious path toward stability. This is the story of how one forgotten battle changed everything, and why understanding it helps us see the hidden forces that truly shape history. In this video, we're going to journey back to the 15th century, to a Europe torn apart by faith, ambition, and social upheaval. We'll walk the field at Lipany, meet the leaders whose decisions altered destinies, and uncover the military innovations that made this battle so unique. You'll discover how the aftermath of this single day influenced diplomacy, culture, and power from the Holy Roman Empire to the Ottoman frontier. And perhaps most importantly, we'll explore why such a decisive moment has been largely erased from our collective memory. By the end, you'll see history not as a series of famous dates, but as a tapestry woven with threads both bright and hidden. And you'll understand how the forgotten Battle of Lipany quietly shaped the world we live in today. To understand the powder keg that was Europe in the 1430s, you have to imagine a continent still reeling from a century of chaos. The Black Death had swept through generations before, but its shadow lingered, leaving populations thin and economies fragile. The Great Schism had seen not one, but three rival popes claiming authority, shattering the unity of the Catholic Church and leaving the faithful deeply confused about who held spiritual power. Into this vacuum of authority stepped kings and emperors, all grasping for more control. This was a world where your identity, your very safety, was tied to your faith and your feudal lord, and both of those anchors were shaking violently. Nowhere was this turmoil more intense than in the heart of the continent, in the lands of Bohemia, which was ground zero for a revolution that threatened to burn it all down. For over 15 years, the Hussite Wars had turned this region into a bloody battlefield, a conflict that was so much more than just a religious disagreement. It was a social explosion, a political rebellion, and a military innovation lab all at once. On one side were the reformist Hussites, followers of the martyred preacher Jan Hus, who demanded changes to what they saw as a corrupt and distant church. They wanted to worship in their own language, receive communion in both kinds, that's both the bread and the wine, which was a radical idea at the time, and they challenged the very wealth and power of the clergy. Arrayed against them were the forces of the Catholic Church and the Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund, who saw this uprising as a direct threat to the entire established order. If these ideas spread, they could unravel the fabric of society from England to Italy, and the great powers of the day were watching, not with detached interest, but with mounting anxiety. The Kingdom of Poland and the Kingdom of Hungary, both major players, were deeply entangled, their own ambitions and security tied to the outcome of this fight. Emperor Sigismund himself was a fascinating, almost tragic figure. As the King of Hungary and the titular King of Bohemia, he was desperate to claim his Czech throne from a capital that rejected him. He was a man caught between his duty to the church and his need to pacify a rebellious nation, a leader whose repeated military failures against the Hussites had made him a laughingstock in some courts and a determined nemesis in others. His relentless efforts to crush the rebellion through crusade after failed crusade only fueled the resolve of his enemies. Meanwhile, the average person was just trying to survive. Economic turmoil was constant. Trade routes were disrupted by marauding armies, fields were burned, and towns were looted. The constant state of war, combined with residual outbreaks of plague, meant that stability was a distant dream for most people. They were desperate for peace, but deeply divided on what that peace should look like. Should it come through total victory for their cause, or through a compromise that might save their homes but sacrifice their ideals? This was the social tinderbox, a population exhausted by war yet passionate about their beliefs, led by figures whose ideologies couldn't have been more different. The stage was set not for a simple battle between good and evil, but for a complex, heartbreaking tragedy where everyone believed they were in the right. The spark that would finally ignite this powder keg wouldn't come from an outside invader, but from within the revolution itself, on a field near a small village called Lipany. To truly grasp the fire that consumed Bohemia, we must start with the man whose name became its battle cry, Jan Hus, born into a humble family around 1369. Hus was a scholar and preacher whose brilliance and passion for reform made him a beacon for those disillusioned with the church. From his pulpit at the Bethlehem Chapel in Prague, he didn't just deliver sermons, he ignited a movement. He railed against the sale of indulgences, the rampant corruption among the clergy, and the very idea that the church's wealth and power were signs of its divine favor. He argued for a return to Scripture, for the right of ordinary people to worship in their own language, and most radically, for the practice of utracism, communion in both kinds, meaning both the bread and the wine for all believers, not just the priests. This was a direct challenge to the hierarchical structure of the medieval church, asserting that every person had a direct connection to God. His ideas were dangerous because they were so appealing to the common folk, and in 1415, the church made an example of him. Summoned to the Council of Constance under a promise of safe passage, he was instead arrested, tried for heresy, and burned at the stake. The story goes that as the flames rose around him, he declared, "You may roast a goose, but a swan will come after me whom you will not roast." The name Hus means goose in Czech, making his words a stunning prophecy. His death didn't extinguish his ideas, it martyred him, turning his teachings into a rallying cry that spread like wildfire across Bohemia. Outrage over his betrayal and execution unified a diverse coalition of nobles, knights, townspeople, and peasants, all demanding change. This coalition, however, was far from unified in its goals. The Hussite movement quickly splintered into two main factions, each with a vastly different vision for the future. The moderates, known as the utraquists, were largely the nobility and wealthy burghers. They wanted reform within the system. They sought the chalice, that right to communion in both kinds, and an end to the most egregious church abuses, but they were also pragmatic. They believed in negotiating with the Catholic powers to secure their place and privileges within a revised structure. On the other side were the radicals, the Taborites. Named for their fortified mountain city of Tabor, they were the true revolutionaries. Drawn from the peasantry, the poor, and the lower clergy, they dreamed of something far more profound, a complete overturning of the social order. They envisioned a society based on the equality of all believers, the abolition of many feudal dues, and a pure apostolic church free from any Roman influence. They weren't just fighting for a reformed church, they were fighting for a new world, and for a time it seemed they might win. Facing down 5 separate crusades called by the Pope and led by Emperor Sigismund, the Hussites did the unthinkable. They kept winning. Their secret was a military innovation so effective it changed warfare, the war wagon. These were heavy, armored carts that could be chained together into a mobile fortress. From behind these walls, Hussite soldiers, many of whom were farmers, not professional warriors, could unleash a devastating barrage of crossbow bolts and early cannon fire, then send out shock troops to finish off disorganized attackers. It was a democratizing force in warfare, allowing a people's army to defeat the knightly cavalry of Europe's elite. Under the legendary command of blind General Jan Žižka, and later the radical leader Prokop the Bald, they turned defense into a devastating art form, even taking their fight beyond Bohemia's borders on fearsome raids called beautiful rides that spread panic throughout the Holy Roman Empire. This was far more than a religious dispute. As historian Howard Kaminsky so aptly put it, the Hussites were the first successful revolutionaries of early modern Europe. Their struggle challenged the very bedrock of feudal society, the idea that a divinely ordained hierarchy with the Pope and Emperor at the top was immutable. Their success sent a chilling message to every king, duke, and bishop watching from afar. If it could happen in Bohemia, it could happen anywhere. The ideas of Hus and his followers inspired reformers from England to Italy, proving that authority, no matter how ancient, could be questioned and resisted. This potent combination of military success and radical ideology is what made the Hussites so terrifying to the established powers of 15th century Europe. They weren't just heretics to be burned, they were the specter of a new, unpredictable world order, and that fear made a final, decisive confrontation not just likely but inevitable. But the very success that made the Hussites a formidable force also contained the seeds of their own undoing. By the early 1430s, the revolutionary fervor that had united them against a common enemy began to fracture under the weight of its own internal contradictions. The movement was like a great rope woven from many strands: noble ambition, religious zeal, peasant aspiration, and urban pragmatism. For over a decade, this rope had been strong enough to pull down the might of imperial crusades. Now, pulled in too many directions at once, those strands began to fray and snap. The dream of a unified Bohemia free from foreign interference was crumbling from within, as the moderates and radicals found their visions for the future to be utterly incompatible. The question was no longer how to defeat the emperor, but what to do after victory was within reach. At the heart of this schism were two men who embodied these opposing worldviews. On one side stood Divish Borek of Miltinic, a powerful Utraquist noble. He and his fellow landowners had fought for reform, but they had also seen their estates burned, their trade routes severed, and their stability shattered by 15 years of relentless warfare. For them, the revolution had achieved its main goal. It had forced the church and the empire to the negotiating table. The Council of Basel, a great ecclesiastical gathering, was now offering a compromise, the Compactata. This agreement would grant the Bohemians their central demand of communion in both kinds, offering a path to peace and, crucially, political legitimacy. To Divish Borek, this was not a surrender, it was a strategic victory. He believed that continued radicalism would only bring more destruction, leaving Bohemia a smoldering ruin vulnerable to its neighbors. His was a philosophy of realpolitik securing what was achievable to save the nation from total collapse. Arrayed against this pragmatic view was the fiery idealism of Prokop the Bold. A brilliant military commander who had led the Hussites to some of their greatest victories, Prokop was a true believer. He saw the Compactata not as a compromise, but as a betrayal of everything Jan Hus had died for. To him, the fight was not just about the chalice, it was about building a new Jerusalem, a society purged of corruption, inequality, and foreign domination. Accepting a deal from the same church that had burned their hero would be to admit that the blood spilled for over a decade had been for nothing. He and the radical Taborites, along with their allies the Orbites, insisted the war must continue until their entire program of social and religious reform was realized. For Prokop, there could be no peace with the unreformed church. It was a fight to the finish. Emperor Sigismund and the Council of Basel expertly exploited this growing rift. They understood that they could not defeat the Hussites on the battlefield, so they turned to diplomacy as a weapon. From the safety of Basel, church diplomats dangled the promise of the Compactata specifically before the moderate nobles, subtly encouraging them to see the radicals as the true obstacle to peace. Sigismund, ever the cunning politician, remained in the background, letting the church offer concessions he would later be forced to acknowledge. His goal was unchanged, to reclaim his Bohemian throne, but his strategy had shifted from blunt force to a more insidious campaign of division. He was betting that the Bohemians would do to themselves what his armies could not. The winter and spring of 1434 saw this Cold War of ideology turn hot. What began as heated debates in town councils and noble estates soon erupted into violent skirmishes between rival Hussite factions. Moderate-controlled Prague and the radical stronghold of Tabor became armed camps, their mutual suspicion poisoning any chance of reconciliation. In one particularly telling incident, a convoy of supplies meant for a moderate town was intercepted and looted by radical troops, an act that felt like a declaration of war between former brothers in arms. Failed negotiations followed one after another, each meeting ending in greater acrimony and distrust. The air in Bohemia grew thick with the anticipation of violence, a sense that the fragile peace could not hold. The great rope of unity had frayed to its last fiber, and the entire nation held its breath, waiting for the final, inevitable snap. That snap would come on a field near the village of Lipany, where the two sides of the Hussite soul would meet not in debate, but in devastating fratricidal conflict. The morning of May 30th, 1434, dawned with a heavy tension over the fields near the small village of Lipany. The two armies, positioned on opposing ridges, were a heartbreaking sight. Here were men who had once stood shoulder to shoulder against imperial crusades, now preparing to slaughter each other over the future of their revolution. On one side, the combined force of moderate Utraquists and a small contingent of Catholic allies, numbering around 12,000, stood in disciplined ranks. Their banners, a mix of the Utraquist chalice and noble coats of arms, fluttered in the breeze. Facing them were roughly 10,000 radical Taborites and Orbites, their flags bearing the emblem of the communion chalice but also more militant symbols, a clear reflection of their uncompromising stance. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and the metallic anticipation of bloodshed, a silence broken only by the nervous whinny of horses and the distant call of crows. The radicals, true to their tried and tested doctrine, began the battle by forming a nearly impregnable fortress of war wagons. They chained these heavy, armored carts together into a defensive circle, creating a mobile stronghold from which their crossbowmen and handgunners could unleash a devastating hail of projectiles. It was the same formation that had brought them victory against overwhelming odds at battles like Usti nad Labum and Damascus. From behind this wall of wood and iron, they felt secure, confident that their enemies would break upon their defenses as so many imperial armies had before. The moderate commanders, however, were not Sigismund's foreign generals, they were Hussites themselves. They knew the strengths of the wagon fort intimately because they had helped invent its tactics. And more importantly, they knew its one critical weakness. It was a purely defensive formation. To win, the men inside had to be lured out. The initial phase of the battle unfolded as a brutal but inconclusive exchange of artillery and gunfire across the no-man's land between the ridges. The moderates then sent their cavalry in a series of probing charges against the radical lines. These were not attempts to break the fort, but rather to test its resolve and to set the stage for a grand deception. The radical defenders, disciplined and fierce, repelled these attacks with ease, their gunfire cutting down horses and riders. Then the masterstroke began. Following a prearranged signal, the entire moderate center infantry and cavalry alike appeared to lose its nerve. Their banners wavered, their lines broke, and they began a disorderly, frantic retreat down the slope and back towards their original position. To the radical commanders watching from the wagon fort, it looked like victory. Their enemies were routing. The chance to annihilate the moderate army and secure total victory for their cause was suddenly within grasp. This was the fatal temptation. Abandoning the safety of their defensive formation, the radical soldiers poured out from behind the war wagons in a chaotic, triumphant surge, charging headlong down the hill in pursuit of their fleeing enemy. They believed the day was won, but the retreat was a carefully orchestrated ruse. As the radical ranks broke apart in their eager pursuit, they lost all cohesion, becoming a scattered mob instead of a disciplined army. At that precise moment, the moderate cavalry, which had been held in reserve and hidden from view, wheeled around and slammed into the exposed flanks of the radical pursuit. Simultaneously, the soldiers who had been fleeing suddenly halted, turned, and reformed their lines, now attacking the disorganized radicals from the front. The trap was sprung perfectly. In an instant, the hunters became the hunted, completely surrounded and cut off from their only source of protection, their abandoned wagon fort. The battle dissolved into a nightmarish scene of close-quarters carnage. The field, once a place of quiet pasture, was now a churning sea of mud and blood. The air, once silent, was filled with the horrific symphony of battle, the clash of steel on steel, the screams of wounded men and horses, the panicked shouts of commanders trying in vain to rally their surrounded troops. The radical army, caught in the open and attacked from all sides, fought with the desperate courage of those who know they are fighting for their very lives and their deepest beliefs. But their fate was sealed. The pivotal moment came when Prokop the Bold, the charismatic heart and soul of the radical cause, was cut down in the melee. The exact circumstances are lost to time, whether he fell to a knight's sword or a common foot soldier's spear, but his death sent a paralyzing wave of despair through his followers. With their leader gone, their formation shattered, and hope extinguished, the radical resistance collapsed. What followed was not just a defeat but a slaughter. The moderates and their Catholic allies, perhaps fueled by years of bitter ideological rivalry and the raw brutality of civil war, showed little mercy. Chroniclers of the time, though their numbers are often exaggerated, report that some 1,300 radicals were killed on the field, with many more cut down as they tried to flee. The radical movement, which had for over a decade been the most fearsome military force in Central Europe, was decimated in a matter of hours, not by a foreign crusader, but by its own brothers in arms. The cunning feigned retreat, a tactic as old as warfare itself, had been executed with devastating perfection. It was a masterstroke of military deception that did more than win a battle. It extinguished a revolution and decided the fate of a nation between the rising and the setting of the same sun. Behind every great historical turning point are the people who shaped it, and the Battle of Lipany was no exception. It was a clash not just of armies, but of profoundly different worldviews, embodied by three men whose ambitions and fears collided on that field. First, consider Divish Borek of Miltynach, the commander of the moderate Utraquist forces. He was not a villain seeking power for its own sake, but a pragmatic nobleman who had witnessed 15 years of his homeland being torn apart. For him, the revolution had achieved its goal. It had forced the Catholic Church to negotiate. The offer on the table, the Compactata of Basel, granted the key Hussite demand of communion in both kinds. To Divish, accepting this compromise wasn't a betrayal, it was a necessary step to prevent Bohemia's total annihilation. He represents the philosophy of realpolitik, the belief that the perfect must not be the enemy of the good. In a letter to a fellow noble, he captured this sentiment perfectly, writing, "We fight not for glory, but for the survival of our homeland. A peace with honor is better than a victory that leaves only ashes." His motivation was preservation through pragmatism, a desire to end the bleeding and secure a stable future, even if it meant sacrificing the revolution's most radical dreams. Standing in direct opposition was the radical leader, Prokop the Bald, a priest and a brilliant military strategist who had led the Hussites to some of their greatest victories. Prokop was the heart and soul of the Taborite cause. Where Divish saw pragmatism, Prokop saw principle. He believed that the Compactata was a poisonous trap, a hollow concession offered by the same church that had burned Jan Hus at the stake. To him, accepting it would mean admitting that every drop of blood spilled for over a decade had been for nothing. His vision was not for a reformed Catholic Church, but for a completely new society, a New Jerusalem, built on equality and purified of corruption. He was the unyielding idealist, convinced that any compromise with the old order was a spiritual defeat. A contemporary chronicler recorded him declaring to his troops before battle, "Will you trade the chalice of truth for a king's promise written on water?" His motivation was rooted in a transformative idealism that refused to accept half measures, believing that a complete victory was the only outcome worthy of their immense sacrifice. And then, watching from a distance, was the master of realpolitik himself, Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund. For years, his crusades against the Hussites had ended in humiliating failure, making him a figure of mockery in some European courts. But Sigismund was a patient and cunning political survivor. His primary goal was unchanging, to finally claim his hereditary throne as King of Bohemia and restore his authority. By 1434, he realized he could not achieve this through military force alone. Instead, he skillfully manipulated the growing rift within the Hussite movement. From his court, he encouraged the church's diplomatic overtures to the Utraquist nobles, subtly positioning the radicals as the sole obstacle to peace. He was content to let the Hussites bleed each other dry, knowing that a victory for the more manageable moderates would ultimately pave his way back to power in Prague. A Venetian ambassador at his court reported Sigismund remarking, "Why should my soldiers die to break a rock when the rock is already cracking from within?" His motivation was the cold, calculated restoration of power, and he was perfectly willing to use the hopes and fears of both Hussite factions as tools to achieve it. These three men were more than just military leaders. They were archetypes. Divish Borek embodied the conservative who seeks to save what he can through compromise. Prokop the Bald represented the revolutionary who would rather see everything burn than abandon his ideals. and Emperor Sigismund personified the established power waiting to capitalize on that very division. Their clash at Lipany was a timeless drama about the fate of revolutions, forcing us to ask a difficult question. When does fighting for a principle become a fight for its own sake? And when does the pragmatic choice to ensure survival become a surrender of the very soul you sought to save? The battle they fought centuries ago continues to resonate wherever ideals clash with the hard realities of power. What made the Hussites so formidable, and what ultimately led to their downfall at Lipany, was not just faith or leadership, but a breathtakingly simple yet devastatingly effective piece of military technology, the war wagon. Imagine a heavy, reinforced farm cart, the kind used to haul grain or tools. Now armor its sides with thick wooden planks, add hinged panels that could be dropped to create murder holes for shooting, and equip it with hooks and chains so it could be linked to others in a circle. This unassuming vehicle became the Hussites' great equalizer, their secret weapon that for over a decade turned the battlefields of Bohemia into a nightmare for Europe's most heavily armored knights. These were not just carts, they were mobile fortresses, the armored personnel carriers of their day, and they democratized warfare in a way that had never been seen before. The genius of the war wagon tactic was in its layered defense and its accessibility. A typical Hussite wagon fort, or Wagenburg, was a masterpiece of improvised engineering. Once circled and chained together, these wagons created an instant, impenetrable wall. In the gaps between them, soldiers would place large pavises, heavy mobile shields, creating a continuous barrier. Inside this protective ring, the Hussites would position their artillery, early, small cannons known as hoofners, which is actually where the English word howitzer comes from, as well as crossbowmen and men wielding deadly flails. The system was designed to break the charge of feudal cavalry, the dominant military force of the era. A knight on a destrier, bred and trained to smash through infantry lines, was utterly useless against this moving castle. His charge would falter against the wooden wall, and in that moment of confusion he would be cut down by gunfire and hooks from soldiers safe behind their barricades. This innovation was revolutionary because it allowed a people's army to compete with professional soldiers. The Hussite ranks were not filled with career knights who had trained from childhood. They were farmers, blacksmiths, and priests. They didn't have the wealth for expensive plate armor or powerful war horses, but they did have carts, and they had a desperate need to defend themselves. The war wagon tactic turned their weaknesses into strengths. It required discipline and coordination, not individual martial prowess. Every man had a role: drivers to position the wagons, gunners to fire the cannons, infantry to sortie out and attack a disorganized enemy. It was a system that relied on collective action over heroic individual combat, mirroring the more egalitarian ideals of their revolution itself. Before Lipany, this system was virtually unbeatable, allowing them to triumph against incredible odds at famous battles like Suderma and Kutná-Hora. The true testament to its effectiveness is that by the time of Lipany, both sides were using it. The moderate Utraquist nobles had fought alongside the radicals for years. They knew the wagon fort tactics intimately because they had helped develop them. This set the stage for a unique and tragic scenario, a battle where both armies were equipped with the same revolutionary technology, turning the engagement into a high-stakes game of tactical chess. The radicals under Prokop the Bald did exactly what had brought them so much success. They formed their classic defensive wagon fort on high ground and waited for the enemy to break against it. They were playing by the old rules, confident in a system that had never failed them. The moderates, however, were about to rewrite the playbook. Knowing that a direct assault would be suicidal, the moderate commanders, veterans of the same wars, devised a cunning trap. Their feigned retreat was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. It preyed upon the radicals' own experience and expectations. In every previous battle against imperial forces, a disorganized retreat signaled a decisive victory was at hand, the moment to pour out of the wagons and cut down the fleeing enemy. The radicals took the bait exactly as predicted. In their eagerness to deliver a killing blow to their former comrades, they committed the one error the wagon fort system could not forgive. They abandoned their defensive advantage. The moment they streamed out from behind the safety of their chained carts, they transformed from an impregnable fortress into a vulnerable mob. The moderates' hidden cavalry reserves then slammed into their exposed flanks, and the infantry that had been fleeing turned to fight. The radicals were caught in the open, cut off from their wagons, and systematically destroyed. As the renowned Czech military historian Petr Čornich so aptly put it, the war wagon was the tank of the Middle Ages, and its misuse at Lipany marked the end of an era. The wagons themselves weren't defeated. They were circumvented by a superior understanding of human psychology and the predictable patterns of battle. Lipany demonstrated that even the most brilliant technological advantage can be neutralized by a cleverer strategy. The battle signaled a shift away from the purely defensive warfare that had defined the Hussite years and back towards the maneuver and deception that would characterize conflicts for centuries to come. The very tool that had guaranteed Hussite independence for so long became, in that final fratricidal clash, the instrument of their revolution's demise. The dust settled over the field at Lipany to reveal a scene of utter desolation, a victory that felt more like a funeral for a dream. The human cost was staggering. While chroniclers' numbers are always to be taken with caution, the most reliable estimates suggest around 1,300 radical soldiers lay dead, a catastrophic loss that represented the utter annihilation of the Taborites' most experienced and committed fighting force. This was not an army that could be rebuilt. Among the slain were nearly all of its senior commanders and priests, the intellectual and moral core of the radical movement. Prokop the Bald was gone, and with him fell the fiery heart of the revolution. Those leaders not killed on the field were swiftly captured and executed, a deliberate and systematic pruning to ensure the radical tree could never bear fruit again. In a matter of hours, the most fearsome military power in Central Europe had been erased, not by a foreign emperor, but by its own countrymen. With their rivals vanquished, the moderate Utraquist nobility moved with swift and decisive purpose to consolidate their control over a fractured Bohemia. Their first and most crucial act was to finally secure the peace they had long sought. Just weeks after the battle, their diplomats at the Council of Basel sealed the agreement known as the Compactata. This was a landmark document, the first formal treaty in the history of the Catholic Church to grant concessions to a group it had previously condemned as heretical. It officially permitted communion in both kinds for laypeople, the central and most symbolic demand of the entire Hussite cause. For the Utraquists, this was the ultimate vindication. They had fought for over a decade to force the Church to the negotiating table, and now they had their prize official recognition and a legal path back into the fold of Christendom. It was a monumental achievement, but one that came with profound and immediate trade-offs. The most significant concession was the one they made to temporal power. With the radical threat eliminated, the path was finally clear for Emperor Sigismund to claim his prize. The very man who had launched multiple crusades against them, the figurehead of their opposition, was now welcomed back not as a conqueror, but as a legitimate sovereign. In a stunning political reversal, the Utraquist nobles acknowledged Sigismund as the rightful king of Bohemia. The man they had spent 15 years fighting to keep out was now ushered in, his authority secured by the very people who had once defied him. This was the core of their pragmatism. They traded the dream of complete independence for the reality of political stability and religious legitimacy. Sigismund, for his part, was shrewd enough to accept the compromise, knowing that a pacified Bohemia under his crown was infinitely more valuable than a perpetually rebellious one. The aftermath was not peaceful for everyone. A grim reckoning followed for the towns and communities that had been bastions of radical support. Places like Taber and Hradec Kralove, which had been the beating heart of the Taborite cause, faced severe reprisals. Their privileges were revoked, their walls were dismantled, and heavy fines were imposed, a deliberate strategy to break their economic and political power forever. The old social order, which the radicals had sought to overturn, was forcefully reimposed. Nobles reaffirmed their feudal rights over land and labor, and the clergy who had championed the most extreme reforms were silenced or replaced. This period of so-called reconciliation was for many a return to subjugation. The storm of war had finally passed, but as the metaphor goes, it left behind a landscape of wreckage, shattered ideals, broken communities, and a revolution that had cannibalized its most passionate wing. In the end, the Battle of Lipany didn't just end a war, it performed a kind of political surgery. It surgically removed the most radical, unpredictable, and terrifying element of the Hussite movement, the part that had sent shockwaves through the palaces of Europe. The Utrecht victory ensured that Hussitism would survive, but only in a domesticated, manageable form that could be integrated into the existing structures of church and state. The fire that had threatened to burn down the old world was contained, reduced to a controlled burn within a sanctioned hearth. The immediate consequence was peace, but it was a peace purchased with the currency of revolutionary fervor, a settlement that brought stability to the land at the cost of the very ideals that had made the fight so transformative in the first place. The shockwaves from the field at Lipany did not stop at the borders of Bohemia. They rippled out across the entire continent, fundamentally rearranging the chessboard of European power politics. With the most immediate and terrifying internal threat to the feudal order now neutralized, rulers who had spent years nervously watching the Hussite rebellion could finally exhale and turn their attention outward. For Emperor Sigismund, this was a personal and strategic triumph. The man who had been mocked as the Red Fox for his failed campaigns against the Czechs could at last solidify his shaky authority. More importantly, it freed his hands and his resources to confront what he and many contemporary leaders saw as the existential threat to Christendom itself, the relentless advance of the Ottoman Empire into the Balkans. No longer needing to garrison troops for a potential civil war in his own backyard, Sigismund could now pour his energy and what remained of his imperial prestige into building a grand coalition. This meant forging much stronger, more purposeful alliances with his powerful neighbors, King Albert of Hungary and King W. Ladislaw Roman III of Poland, uniting their forces in a common front against the Ottoman Sultan. The pacification of Bohemia didn't just give Sigismund a kingdom, it gave Eastern Europe a fighting chance. In the halls of power in Rome, Avignon, and Paris, the news of the radical Hussites' defeat was met with a profound sense of relief. For over a decade, the papacy had been terrified that the Bohemian heresy would prove contagious, sparking similar upheavals against ecclesiastical authority in other parts of a deeply fractured Europe. The success of a peasant and burgher army in defying both Pope and Emperor had been a dangerously inspiring example. Lipany effectively doused that spark before it could become a wildfire. Catholic monarchs, particularly in France, were reassured that the established social and religious order could be maintained. This newfound confidence had a direct effect on diplomacy. It reduced the perceived need for pan-European crusades against internal enemies and allowed the papacy to begin cautiously rebuilding its moral authority. which had been severely damaged by the recent Great Schism that had seen three rival popes claiming authority. The Council of Basel, which had offered the compromise to the moderates, could now proceed with a greater sense of security, setting a precedent for managing dissent through negotiation rather than solely through force. This chilling effect was equally powerful across other regions where reformist ideas had begun to take root. In the various principalities of Germany, where preachers had been closely following events in Bohemia, the utter destruction of the Taborites served as a stark cautionary tale. Local nobles and clergy could now point to Lipany as proof that radical challenges to the status quo would be met with overwhelming and decisive force, often from within one's own ranks. It fostered a climate of caution that discouraged widespread rebellion, effectively delaying more organized reform movements for nearly a century until the time of Martin Luther. Similarly, in England, where the Lollard movement led by John Wycliffe had predated and even inspired Jan Hus, the outcome at Lipany further marginalized these early calls for change. The message was clear: revolution led to fratricidal bloodshed and ultimately failure. The path of reform, if it were to be taken at all, would have to be far more gradual and carefully managed. The brilliant diplomat and future Pope Pius II, Aeneas Silvius Piccolomini, perfectly captured this complex new reality when he observed, "The fire in Bohemia is quenched, but its smoke will linger." His words were remarkably prescient. The immediate flames of radical revolution had been extinguished, but the smoke, the ideas, the memory of a people's army defeating empires, the demand for a more personal faith continued to hang in the air, a permanent and unsettling part of the European atmosphere. It was a reminder that while you could defeat an army, you could not so easily erase an idea. Lipany's true broader impact was that it created a breathing space for Europe's ruling elite. It granted them a period of relative internal stability, a crucial window where they could focus on external threats, consolidate their own power, and centralize their administrations without the constant fear of a popular, theologically charged revolt from below. This stability, purchased at the cost of Bohemian radicalism, became the foundation upon which the great powers of the next century would build. While the field at Lipany was littered with the bodies of fallen soldiers, the most profound victory was claimed not by a king or a general, but by an institution hundreds of miles away. For the Catholic Church, the outcome of that battle was nothing short of a divine deliverance from its most severe crisis in centuries. To understand the magnitude of this, we have to step back and look at the Church's precarious state in the early 15th century. It was an institution reeling from the Great Schism, a period of nearly 40 years during which two, and at one point three, rival popes claimed the throne of St. Peter, each excommunicating the other and plunging the faithful into confusion and despair. This fracture at the very top had severely weakened the Church's moral authority, making it vulnerable to exactly the kind of fundamental challenge posed by the Hussites. Jan Hus's call for reform wasn't happening in a vacuum. It was a direct response to a church that many saw as corrupt, distant, and spiritually bankrupt. The Hussite Revolution, with its innovative armies and radical theology, wasn't just a local rebellion. It was an existential threat, a virus that seemed capable of spreading across the entire body of Christendom. The Compactata of Basel, the agreement made possible by the Utraquist victory at Lipany, was the Church's masterstroke in neutralizing this threat. It was a document born not from a position of strength, but from one of necessity and cunning. For the first time in its history, the Church formally negotiated with and made concessions to a group it had previously condemned as heretical. By granting the Bohemians the right to communion in both kinds, the Church gave the moderates exactly what they had fought for, but it did so on its own terms. This was not an admission of theological error, it was a brilliant political maneuver. The Church offered the chalice but retained all other points of doctrine, and most importantly, the ultimate authority to interpret that doctrine. This created a powerful template for the future, the management of dissent through controlled, limited concession. It was a strategy of giving a little to keep a lot, of absorbing the shock of rebellion to prevent a total collapse. In essence, the Church learned that it could sometimes preserve its core authority more effectively through strategic compromise than through outright, and often disastrous, suppression. This lesson would echo through the next century when a much larger storm broke over Europe, the Protestant Reformation. When Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg in 1517, he unleashed a wave of dissent that made the Hussite crisis look almost provincial. And yet, the Church's initial response was shaped by the memory of Bohemia. Early attempts at dealing with Lutheranism, particularly at the Diet of Augsburg in 1530, involved offers of negotiation and the possibility of limited concessions, a direct echo of the Basel approach. The goal was the same: to isolate the radicals by appeasing the moderates, to split the movement and bring the more manageable elements back into the fold. While this strategy ultimately failed with Protestantism due to the scale and nature of the demands, it demonstrated an institutional memory at work. The Church had learned from Lipany that some heresies could be contained through diplomacy, and that lesson became a permanent part of its political toolkit. But this religious détente came with a heavy and unpredictable cost. The Compactata of Basel was a classic case of a compromise that satisfied the pragmatic center while infuriating the fringes. For hardline Catholics, particularly in Rome and among the more conservative religious orders, any concession to heresy was an unacceptable betrayal of doctrine. They saw the agreement as a dangerous precedent, a crack in the dam of orthodoxy that could eventually lead to a flood. On the other side, the surviving radical Hussites and their sympathizers viewed the Utraquists who accepted the deal as traitors who had sold out the revolution for a place at the table of power. This deep-seated resentment on both sides meant that the peace brokered at Basel was always fragile, built on a foundation of mutual distrust. It planted seeds of future conflict within Bohemia itself, ensuring that religious tensions would simmer for the next 200 years, eventually boiling over in the cataclysm of the 30 Years' War. This forces us to ask a difficult and reflective question about the long arc of history. Did the Battle of Lipany and the Compactata that followed actually save the medieval church, or did they merely postpone its inevitable reckoning? On one hand, you can argue that it was a salvation. By crushing the radical Hussites, the Church eliminated its most immediate and militarily proficient threat. By granting concessions to the moderates, it reabsorbed a rebellious territory and demonstrated a capacity for adaptation that likely prevented other similar revolts from erupting elsewhere for generations. It bought the Church a crucial century of relative stability to rebuild its authority and centralize its power. On the other hand, you could just as persuasively argue that it was merely a postponement. The Compactata established the dangerous idea that core theological principles were negotiable under political pressure. It created a model of national churches operating with special dispensations from Rome, a model that would be aggressively pursued by kings and princes during the Reformation. In trying to avoid a full-scale reform, the Church may have inadvertently shown future reformers that resistance could be fruitful, that authority could be challenged, and that compromise was possible. The reckoning wasn't avoided, it was simply delayed, and when it finally arrived with Luther and Calvin, it was far more widespread, devastating, and impossible to contain. The religious repercussions of Lipany were therefore a complex and double-edged sword, giving the Church a vital victory in a moment of crisis while simultaneously teaching its future enemies how to win. The clanging of swords on the field at Lipany had barely fallen silent when a different, quieter transformation began to ripple across the Bohemian countryside, a profound economic reset that would reshape the region's destiny for generations. For over 15 years, the constant state of war had strangled commerce, with roads made perilous by marauding bands and fields left fallow as farmers were conscripted into armies. Trade routes that had once connected Prague to vibrant markets in Nuremberg, Vienna, and beyond were severed, isolating the kingdom and starving its urban centers of goods and coin. The immediate aftermath of the battle, while brutal in its human cost, slammed the door on this era of chaotic stagnation. Almost overnight, the pacification of the radical threat meant that merchants could once again pack their wagons with confidence, knowing that the main highways were no longer dominated by rival Hussite factions or imperial reprisals. This reopening of the arteries of trade was the first and most vital breath of life for a suffocating economy. But the true engine of Bohemia's remarkable economic recovery lay beneath the ground, in the rich silver veins of towns like Kutná Hora. Mining was the powerhouse of the medieval Bohemian economy, and the wars had brought this crucial industry to a virtual standstill. Tunnels had flooded, equipment had deteriorated, and the skilled labor force had been dispersed to battlefields. With stability assured by the Utraquist Catholic alliance, a massive effort to restart and expand these mines was launched. Investors, previously terrified by the political risk, now felt confident enough to pour capital into these ventures. New water wheel-driven pumps were installed to drain deep shafts, and advanced smelting techniques were introduced, dramatically increasing output. By the year 1440, just 6 years after Lipany, economic historians estimate that Bohemia's overall economic output, what we might think of as its GDP, had not only recovered to pre-war levels but had likely surpassed them. The kingdom was once again minting its famous groschen coins, a symbol of its returned financial sovereignty and a currency that would once again become a trusted medium of exchange across Central Europe. This surge of prosperity, however, was far from evenly distributed. The economic settlement that followed Lipany was meticulously engineered to benefit the very elites who had orchestrated the moderate victory, the nobility and the wealthy urban patricians. Emperor Sigismund and the Utraquist leadership, now firmly in control, rewarded their loyal supporters with vast tracts of land confiscated from the defeated radical communities and the towns that had supported them. This massive consolidation of property into the hands of a few powerful families created a new, ultra-wealthy aristocratic class with an unprecedented command over the region's agricultural production. They rebuilt fortified manor houses not for defense against crusaders, but as centers of estate management from which they could efficiently collect rents and dues from a now thoroughly pacified peasantry. This reassertion of feudal control was a deliberate reversal of the more egalitarian economic ideals championed by the Taborites, who had dreamed of common ownership of land and the abolition of serfdom. Those dreams died on the field at Lipany, and in their place arose a rigid economic hierarchy that would define Bohemian society for centuries. The suppression of these radical economic demands had a profound and tragic long-term cost. While the noble elite enjoyed newfound wealth, the average peasant or town laborer saw their prospects for economic justice evaporate. The radical Hussite program had included bold ideas like the elimination of many feudal obligations and a more equitable distribution of resources, ideas that were now branded as dangerous and seditious. With the Taborite military wing annihilated, there was no powerful voice left to advocate for the lower classes. wages remained low, old dues were reinstated with vigor, and the legal system was firmly stacked in favor of the landowning class. This created a deep-seated social resentment that simmered beneath the surface of Bohemian society. By prioritizing the economic interests of the elite, the post-Lipany settlement ensured short-term stability and attracted foreign investment, but it also planted the seeds of future class conflict, delaying the kind of social changes that would only arrive much later and with great difficulty. Ultimately, the economic transformation triggered by the battle cemented Bohemia's role as an economic powerhouse within the Holy Roman Empire, but on terms that heavily favored the established order. The silver flowing from its mines financed not only local prosperity, but also the ambitions of the Habsburg dynasty that would eventually inherit the Bohemian crown. The stability that attracted merchants from across Europe also reinforced the very feudal structures that the revolution had sought to dismantle. Lipany's legacy, therefore, is a complex and contradictory one in economic terms. It proved that a military victory could indeed forge a lasting peace and generate immense wealth, but it also demonstrated that such prosperity often comes at the expense of equality, creating a template where the fruits of peace are harvested by the powerful, while the common foot soldier who fought for change is left with little more than the memory of a lost dream. The most immediate and visible social change was the deliberate dismantling of the radical Taborite world. The fortified city of Tabor, the very heart of the movement, was forced to surrender its autonomy. Its walls were not torn down, but its spirit was broken. The radical priests were expelled or silenced, and the unique social experiment they had fostered, a community based on shared property, equality among believers, and a rejection of feudal titles, was systematically dissolved. The lands that had been worked communally were confiscated and redistributed to loyal Utraquist nobles or returned to the Catholic Church. This was more than a military defeat. It was the erasure of an alternative way of life, a deliberate act to ensure that the radical vision of a new Jerusalem could never again take root in Bohemian soil. The Taborites weren't just defeated, their very model for society was declared a dangerous fantasy and wiped from the map. In its place, the victorious Utraquist nobility, now firmly in alliance with the returning Catholic hierarchy, enforced a strict return to a traditional hierarchical social order. The old lines of authority, blurred and challenged during 15 years of revolution, were now redrawn with stark clarity. The nobility reclaimed their ancient rights over the land and the people who worked it, reimposing feudal dues and labor obligations that the radicals had abolished. The clergy, both Utraquist and Catholic, resumed their privileged positions at the top of the social pyramid, their authority bolstered by the Compactata, which had granted them a sanctioned role within the state. For the common people, particularly the peasants and urban poor who had formed the backbone of the Taborite armies, this was a profound and disheartening reversal. The dream of social equality and liberation from serfdom, which had driven them to fight for so long, evaporated. They found themselves once again subjects, their lives and labor commanded by the very class they had once dared to defy. Yet, to say that Lipany completely erased the Hussite revolution would be a profound oversimplification. While the radical social project was crushed, many of the movement's core ideals proved incredibly resilient, embedding themselves deep within the culture and identity of the Czech people. The most enduring legacy was the use of the Czech language in religious services. The Compactata explicitly permitted the continuation of vernacular worship, and this was a change that could not be undone. Hearing the scriptures read and the hymns sung in their own tongue, rather than in Latin, fostered a powerful sense of national and spiritual identity that set the Bohemians apart from their German-speaking neighbors. This linguistic and religious distinctiveness became a cornerstone of Czech culture, a quiet but persistent form of resistance against full assimilation into the German-dominated Holy Roman Empire. The chalice, the symbol of Utraquism, remained a powerful national emblem, a constant reminder of their unique religious compromise. We can glimpse the painful human cost of this transition in the story of individuals like Jan, a former Taborite soldier whose name comes down to us in a fragment of a parish record. Before Lipany, Jan had lived in the radical community of Oreb, believing in a world where a blacksmith's son could be the equal of a baron. After the battle, he was lucky to escape with his life. Wounded and disillusioned, he made his way back to his home village, only to find his family's small plot of land had been forfeited to a local lord who had supported the moderates. With no property and his old convictions now dangerous to voice, Jan had little choice but to accept a position as a farmhand on the very estate he once might have fought to dismantle. The parish priest, a pragmatic Utraquist, recorded his marriage a few years later, noting simply his name and his new occupation, with no mention of his past as a heretic. Jan's personal journey from revolutionary idealism to quiet resignation mirrors the larger story of Bohemia itself. He had to adapt, to bury a part of himself to survive in the new normality, a normality built upon the ashes of his former dreams. In the end, the social impact of Lipany was not a simple return to the past, but a complex and forceful channeling of revolutionary energy into safer, more manageable forms. The Utraquist victory ensured that the explosive demand for total social and religious transformation was redirected into a sanctioned, contained national church. Bohemian society remained more Czech and more religiously unique than it had been before the Hussite Wars, but it was also more firmly under the control of a conservative elite. The revolution was not erased, it was domesticated. The fire that had threatened to consume the old world was banked, its heat reduced to a warm glow within a hearth that the nobility and clergy now carefully tended. This painful reconciliation allowed Bohemia to finally reintegrate into the broader tapestry of Europe, but it did so carrying within it a distinct and stubborn identity, forged in the fires of revolution and tempered by the hard compromise of Lipany. Yet in the quiet spaces of Bohemia's churches and the pages of its chronicles, a different kind of struggle was taking place, a battle for the soul of memory itself. The physical conflict had ended, but the cultural war over what Lipany meant and how it would be remembered was just beginning. The victorious Utraquist elite, now the stewards of Bohemia's future, faced a delicate task: how to commemorate a victory that was also a fratricide, and how to celebrate a compromise that had required the slaughter of former comrades. Their solution was not to erase the past, but to reframe it through a powerful new cultural language, one that wove together threads from both sides of the conflict into a unique and enduring tapestry. This was not the art of pure triumph, but the art of reconciliation, a visual and literary attempt to heal a nation's deep wounds by finding beauty in its complex, painful truth. This new aesthetic found its most stunning expression in the architecture and art of Prague's churches, particularly the Church of Our Lady before Tin, which stands to this day in the old town square. Before Lipany, Hussite churches were often stark, puritanical spaces, stripped of what radicals considered Catholic idolatry. No statues, no ornate altarpieces, no gold. After the battle, a new style emerged, funded by wealthy Utraquist patrons. They commissioned artists to create works that were both pious and distinctly Bohemian. In the Tin Church, you can see this fusion perfectly. The chalice, the ultimate symbol of the Hussite demand for communion in both kinds, is proudly displayed, often carved into portals or depicted in stained glass. Yet right beside it, you might find a traditional statue of the Virgin Mary or a painting of a Catholic saint. This was not a surrender to Rome, it was a declaration of a new hybrid identity. The message was clear: we are both. We are Utraquists, we have our chalice, but we are also part of the broader Christian world. This artistic compromise gave people a visual language for the political and religious settlement they were now living, turning theological agreement into something beautiful and tangible that they could see and touch every Sunday. The written word played an equally crucial role in shaping how Lipany would be understood by future generations. Chroniclers like Bartoszek of Drahonis, who actually fought in the Hussite Wars, set about the task of recording these tumultuous events. Their accounts are fascinating because they are not simple victory tales. Bartoszek, writing for an Utraquist audience, memorializes the Battle of Lipany not as a glorious triumph, but as a painful but necessary surgery. He portrays the radical Taborites not as pure villains, but as lost brothers, whose ideals were noble but whose methods had become a threat to the very survival of the nation. He depicts the moderate leaders as sorrowful figures who took up arms with heavy hearts, compelled by duty to save Bohemia from itself. This literary framing was essential. It transformed the battle from a shameful act of civil war into a tragic national sacrifice, a terrible price that had to be paid for peace and stability. It created a founding myth for the new Utraquist-dominated Bohemia, one based on the sober virtue of pragmatism over the dangerous flames of unchecked idealism. Despite these efforts, the memory of Lipany could not compete with the sheer cataclysmic scale of the war that would engulf Bohemia nearly 2 centuries later. The 30 Years' War, which began with the defenestration of Prague in 1618, was a conflict of such immense brutality and devastation that it simply overwrote the earlier struggle in the popular imagination. Where the Hussite Wars were a foundational, internal Czech story, the 30 Years' War was a European-wide catastrophe that reshaped the entire continent. Entire regions of Bohemia were depopulated, and the kingdom lost its independence for centuries, fully absorbed into the Habsburg Empire. In the face of such a monumental tragedy, the battle between Utraquists and Taborites began to seem like a distant, almost provincial family quarrel. It faded from popular memory, becoming the domain of scholars and antiquarians, a footnote in the long march towards a much greater national disaster. But history has a way of circling back, and in the 19th century, as waves of nationalism swept across Europe, Czech intellectuals and artists began digging into their past to find the roots of their unique identity. They rediscovered the Hussite period, and with it the Battle of Lipany. For the Czech national revivalists, it was a deeply ambiguous and troubling touchstone. On one hand, they revered the Hussites as brave early champions of Czech sovereignty and religious freedom. The radical Taborites, with their democratic ideals and defiance of German emperors, were particularly appealing figures. But this created a problem. How could they celebrate a movement whose most idealistic wing was crushed by more pragmatic Czechs? Lipany became a difficult, uncomfortable part of their history. It was a moment that had ensured Bohemia's survival, but had also doomed its most revolutionary spirit. This ambivalence is why Lipany never achieved the mythic status of a battle like the White Mountain, which was a clear-cut defeat by a foreign enemy. As the modern Czech historian Jiří Rak so eloquently put it, Lipany is our forgotten crucible, where our identity was forged in compromise. It is a battle that speaks to the central, enduring tension of the Czech experience, the constant negotiation between proud independence and pragmatic survival within larger power structures. This cultural legacy is not one of simple heroes and villains, but of nuanced, difficult truths. The art from the aftermath of Lipany does not glorify war, it seeks to make peace with a complicated past. The literature does not boast of victory, It mourns a tragedy that was deemed necessary, and the modern memory of the battle is not one of national pride, but of thoughtful, almost melancholic reflection. It stands as a permanent cultural reminder that the most defining moments in a nation's history are rarely the simple ones, and that the stories we tell about ourselves are often layered with pride, regret, and the sober understanding that the path to survival is rarely straight and never pure. To truly appreciate the quiet significance of a battle like Lipany, we have to step back and look at the broader canvas of history, where countless pivotal moments have been similarly overshadowed. It is far from alone in its paradoxical status, an engagement that decisively shaped the world, yet never quite entered the popular imagination. Consider the Battle of Ain Jalut, fought in 1260 in what is now modern-day Israel. For decades, the Mongol war machine had seemed utterly unstoppable, forging the largest contiguous land empire in history and leaving a trail of shattered cities and empires from China to Eastern Europe. Their defeat of the Abbasid Caliphate and sack of Baghdad just 2 years earlier had sent a shockwave of terror throughout the Islamic world and Christendom alike. At Ain Jalut, however, a Mamluk army from Egypt finally met and crushed a Mongol force. This was not just a military victory, it was a psychological earthquake. It proved the Mongols could be beaten, halting their westward expansion into Africa and the Mediterranean permanently, and allowing Mamluk power to solidify. Ain Jalut arguably saved the cultural and political heart of the Middle East from utter subjugation, yet outside of specialist circles, its name draws blank stares, utterly eclipsed by more famous clashes like Tours or Vienna. Jumping forward more than 6 centuries, a similar story of forgotten consequence unfolds with the Battle of Warsaw in 1920, often dramatically called the Miracle on the Vistula. In the summer of that year, the Bolshevik Red Army, flush with victory in the Russian Civil War, was surging westward, intent on spreading the communist revolution into a war-weary and fractured Europe. Poland stood as the last major barrier. As Soviet forces closed in on Warsaw itself, the situation appeared hopeless to outside observers. Many Western embassies began hastily evacuating, and the world prepared for Poland to be overrun. In a stunning and complex counter-offensive, Polish forces managed to outmaneuver and rout the invading armies, sending them into a chaotic retreat. This victory did more than just preserve Poland's fragile independence. It critically damaged the momentum of the Bolshevik revolutionary export, effectively containing the Soviet state within its borders for the next 2 decades and fundamentally altering the political landscape of interwar Europe. It was a world historic event, yet it remains a footnote in most 20th century narratives, its monumental importance obscured by the subsequent and even greater horrors of the Second World War. So why do some battles like Gettysburg or D-Day become household names etched into national mythologies and school curriculums, while others of equal or greater consequence fade into the footnotes? The reasons are rarely about the sheer scale or tactical brilliance of the engagement itself. More often, it is a matter of storytelling, of which events fit neatly into a later nation's founding myth or a victor's preferred narrative. A battle is far more likely to be remembered if it can be packaged as a clear-cut, morally righteous struggle, a defining moment of liberation or patriotic defense. The messy, fratricidal conflict at Lipany, where Czech fought Czech over a difficult compromise, doesn't offer the same clean, heroic storyline as a battle against a foreign invader. Its outcome was ambiguous, a victory that felt like a loss for many, and that complexity resists easy memorialization. Furthermore, the relentless march of subsequent events acts as a powerful eraser. The colossal tragedy of the 30 Years' War, which devastated Central Europe a century after Lipany, simply overwrote the earlier conflict in the region's memory. The trauma was so much greater, the stakes felt so much higher that the Hussite Wars were reduced to a mere prelude. In the same way, the Battle of Warsaw, for all its drama, was soon overshadowed by the global cataclysm of World War II and the subsequent Iron Curtain that descended over the very nation it had saved. When a later, larger conflict directly shapes the modern world, it inevitably steals the spotlight from the turning points that made that modern world possible in the first place. The hand of propaganda and education also plays a decisive role in choosing what we remember. For centuries, the official Catholic and imperial historiography had little interest in celebrating the Hussites, even the moderate Utraquists. To highlight Lipany would be to acknowledge the power and legitimacy of a heretical movement, so it was often minimized or framed solely as the defeat of dangerous radicals. National myth-making is a selective process. Nations tend to commemorate unambiguous victories that fuel national pride, not the painful, necessary compromises that ensure survival. We build monuments to our glorious triumphs, not to our sober, pragmatic choices. This selective memory creates a distorted picture of history, one that emphasizes dramatic, flashpoint moments while ignoring the subtle, often internal, shifts that truly determine the direction of a continent's destiny. By placing Lipany alongside Ain Jalut and Warsaw, we begin to see a pattern, a hidden geography of history where the most important coordinates are often the ones left off the main map. Perhaps the most persistent and misleading myth surrounding the Battle of Lipany is the simplistic notion that it was a clear-cut victory for the Catholic Church over the Hussite heretics. This version of events, often favored by later Catholic chroniclers seeking to downplay the complexity of the conflict, paints a picture of Orthodox forces finally crushing a rebellion. The truth, as the records clearly show, is far more nuanced and ultimately more tragic. The armies that faced each other on that field were not divided by faith in the way we might imagine. On both sides, the vast majority of soldiers were Hussites. The moderate Utraquist force was comprised of Czech nobles and their retainers who had fought for the Chalice for over a decade, and they were joined by only a very small contingent of actual Catholic allies. This was not a holy war against an external enemy. It was a brutal civil war, a fratricidal clash between former brothers in arms over the soul and future of their revolution. To frame it as a Catholic triumph is to miss the profound internal drama entirely, a drama of pragmatism clashing with idealism that resonates through history. Another deeply ingrained misconception is that Lipany spelled the absolute end of Hussitism, completely eradicating the reform movement from Bohemia. This is a fundamental misreading of the aftermath. What was eradicated was the radical, militarized wing of the movement, the Taborites, and their vision of a total social and religious overhaul. The Hussite cause itself, in its more moderate Utraquist form, not only survived but achieved its primary objective. The Compactata of Basel, the agreement negotiated directly because of the Utraquist victory, granted the central demand of communion in both kinds. For decades afterwards, Bohemia existed as a kingdom with its own officially sanctioned, unique Christian practice. Utraquist churches thrived, and a distinct Czech Protestant identity took root, one that would persist and eventually contribute to the larger Reformation a century later. Lipany didn't end Hussitism. It transformed it from a revolutionary threat into a managed national church, ensuring its survival in a compromised but lasting form. We often view major historical events as inevitable, the unavoidable collision of unstoppable forces. The narrative suggests that after years of war, a final, decisive battle was the only possible conclusion. However, a closer look at the primary sources reveals a different story, one filled with tense negotiation and fleeting chances for peace. In the months leading up to May 1434, there was a flurry of diplomatic activity. Letters between the Utraquist nobility and the Council of Basel showed genuine, though fraught, attempts to find a negotiated settlement that could satisfy the moderates without forcing a confrontation with the radicals. There were multiple meetings, proposals, and counter-proposals. The radical leader Prokop the Bald himself participated in some of these discussions. The fact that these talks ultimately failed does not mean they were insignificant or that war was preordained. It means that human personalities, mistrust, and the high stakes of their ideals ultimately overruled diplomacy. The battle was a catastrophic failure of politics, not an inevitable act of fate. These myths persist because they offer a cleaner, simpler story. A straightforward victory of good over evil is easier to tell and to digest than a painful tale of a revolution consuming its own children. It is more comforting to believe that a movement was utterly vanquished by an external foe than to confront the uncomfortable truth that it fractured from within over irreconcilable differences about its own future. And it is easier to see history as a sequence of inevitable events than to acknowledge the role of chance, failed communication, and individual choices that lead to tragedy. By clinging to these oversimplifications, we do a disservice to the complex reality of the past. We lose the human drama of leaders like Divish Borek and Prokop the Bald, both of whom were convinced their path was the only one that could save their homeland from ruin. There were no clear-cut villains on the field at Lipany, only protagonists in a heartbreaking tragedy where each side was tragically, understandably convinced that they were the ones fighting to save their cause from destruction. For centuries, the Battle of Lipany existed primarily in the fragile pages of chronicles and the fading echoes of folk memory, a story passed down, subject to the distortions of time and perspective. But in recent decades, the silent earth near the small Czech village has begun to give up its secrets, offering a powerful, tangible truth that transcends the written word. Archaeological excavations around the suspected battle site have moved the event from the realm of legend into the stark reality of forensic science, providing a chillingly intimate window into that fateful day in 1434. The most haunting discoveries have been the mass graves, pits where the fallen were unceremoniously buried in the battle's immediate aftermath. These are not the neat, individual graves of a churchyard. They are communal tombs of desperation, containing the tangled remains of dozens of men, a silent testament to the sheer scale of the slaughter that chroniclers reported. The skeletons themselves are archives of violence, their bones acting as a brutal ledger of the battle's final moments. Forensic anthropologists carefully studying these remains have catalogued a horrifying array of injuries consistent with 15th century warfare. Skulls exhibit devastating fractures from the impact of war hammers and maces. Rib cages and limb bones bear the clean, deep cuts of swords and halberds, while others show the distinctive puncture wounds from crossbow bolts and the pitting caused by early gunpowder weapons. The pattern of these injuries is particularly telling. Many of the lethal blows are found on the backs of skulls or the rear of shoulder blades, grimly corroborating the historical accounts of the radicals being surrounded and cut down from behind as they fled the moderates' trap. This is not the abstract, heavy casualties of a history book. This is the physical evidence of a rout of men struck down as they ran for their lives. Beyond confirming the brutality of the engagement, these archaeological finds serve as a crucial tool for verification, acting as a check against the potential biases of the medieval chroniclers. For example, the discovery of broken metal fittings, rusted nails from thick planks, and fragments of hardened wood precisely matches descriptions of the famous Hussite War wagons. Finding these artifacts scattered across the battlefield, and particularly in concentrations away from the main burial sites, helps archaeologists map the initial positions of the wagon forts and the subsequent areas of the chaotic melee. Equally important are the coins uncovered at the site. Numismatics, the study of currency, allows experts to date the event with remarkable precision. Coins minted during the reign of Emperor Sigismund, and crucially, none minted after 1434, create a firm terminus ante quem, confirming that the material evidence aligns perfectly with the accepted historical date of the battle. Perhaps the most profound contribution of archaeology, however, is its power to humanize the anonymous participants of history. Through advanced scientific techniques like stable isotope analysis, researchers can now read the life stories locked inside the soldiers' teeth and bones. By analyzing the chemical signatures in tooth enamel which forms in childhood, they can determine the geographic region where a person grew up. Shockingly, this has revealed that not all the fallen were local Bohemians. Some of the men who died at Lipany spent their childhoods hundreds of miles away, suggesting they may have been mercenaries or idealistic volunteers drawn to the Hussite cause from across Europe, adding a new layer of complexity to our understanding of the conflict's reach. Furthermore, analysis of the bones can reveal details about their diet and health, showing a population that was often malnourished and bore the signs of a hard, physically demanding life long before they ever faced an enemy on the battlefield. This move from the general to the intensely personal is what makes archaeology so vital to our understanding. As one leading archaeologist on the project poignantly stated, every shovel of dirt tells us about the price of ideology. Each fractured skull was a man with a name, a family, and a belief he was willing to die for. Each rusted arrowhead was loosed by another man, equally convinced of his own righteousness. The scattered coins were carried in a pouch by someone who likely hoped to spend them later, a hope extinguished in the mud of Lipany. This tangible, physical evidence does more than just verify facts. It bridges the immense gap of centuries, making the abstract struggle for power and faith devastatingly real. It forces us to confront the human cost of the ideological battles that, then as now, reshape our world, reminding us that history is ultimately written not in ink, but in bone and soil. The outcome of a battle is rarely determined by courage or numbers alone. Often, it is the very ground upon which men fight that writes the final verdict. The fields near the small village of Lipany were not chosen by accident for that fateful encounter in May 1434. This was a landscape that seemed almost purpose-built for the dramatic and decisive clash that would unfold. The terrain featured a broad, gently sloping ridge that provided a perfect stage for the Hussite signature weapon, the war wagon fort. This open, flat expanse allowed the radical Taborites to form their classic defensive circle, chaining their armored carts together into what they believed was an impregnable fortress, just as they had done to defeat so many imperial armies before. The geography gave them confidence in their tried and tested tactics, a confidence that would ultimately be their undoing. Yet, it was the subtle features surrounding this main stage that granted the moderate Utraquist commanders their crucial advantage. A series of low, rolling hills and shallow depressions flanked the primary ridge, creating areas of dead ground where movements could be concealed. The moderates, intimately familiar with this topography, used these features to perfection. When they executed their now famous feigned retreat, their cavalry and infantry didn't just run, they disappeared. They pulled back in a controlled but seemingly panicked manner, using the folds in the land to mask their numbers and their true intention, vanishing from the view of the radical commanders watching from the wagon fort. This carefully choreographed deception relied entirely on the land itself to sell the illusion of a complete rout, tempting the Taborites into abandoning their defensive stronghold. This interplay between an open killing field and concealed maneuver zones places Lipany in a long tradition of battles where geography was a silent commander. One need only consider the pass at Thermopylae in ancient Greece, where a narrow strip of land between mountains and sea allowed a tiny Greek force to hold off a massive Persian army for days. The terrain effectively neutralized the Persian advantage in numbers, just as the open field at Lipany was meant to neutralize the charge of heavy cavalry. In both cases, the defending force chose ground that amplified their strengths and minimized their weaknesses. The critical difference at Lipany was that both sides knew how to use that ground. The moderates simply understood the psychology of it better, using the terrain not just for defense, but as the key component in a lethal trick. Beyond the immediate tactical advantages, the location held a deeper strategic significance that elevated the battle from a mere military engagement to a struggle for the soul of Bohemia. Lipany sat astride important regional trade routes connecting the economic heartland of southern Bohemia to the capital city of Prague. Controlling this area meant controlling the flow of goods, food, and reinforcements into the capital, making it a vital strategic prize for any faction seeking to dominate the kingdom. For the moderate Utraquists, securing this corridor was essential for solidifying their political deal with Emperor Sigismund and the Church. For the radical Taborites, holding it was necessary to maintain pressure on Prague and keep their revolutionary vision alive. The field was not just a convenient empty space, it was a geographic linchpin. This fusion of the tactical and the symbolic is what truly amplifies the impact of geography on history. A hill is not just a hill, it is a vantage point that offers control. A valley is not just a valley, it is a funnel that dictates the movement of armies and the fate of nations. At Lipany, the flat field offered the promise of a fair fight according to the established rules of Hussite warfare, while the surrounding hills provided the means to break those rules spectacularly. The location guaranteed that the encounter would be decisive because it was a place worth fighting for, a place that commanded the pathways to power. The battle, therefore, was fought not in a vacuum, but deeply embedded in a landscape that gave shape to the conflict and then bore witness to its tragic conclusion, forever etching the name of an otherwise insignificant village into the hidden geography of European history. The true magnitude of Lipany's impact cannot be measured in the immediate peace it brought to Bohemia, but in the profound and lasting political earthquake it triggered across Central Europe, an aftershock that would be felt for centuries. By decisively ending the internal Hussite threat and reintegrating a pacified Bohemia back into the fold of the Holy Roman Empire, the battle accomplished what decades of imperial crusades had failed to do. It secured the empire's volatile eastern flank at a moment of extreme peril. This newly achieved stability was not a luxury, it was a strategic necessity. Even as the swords were being cleaned at Lipany, a far greater menace was gathering to the southeast. The expanding Ottoman Empire was pushing relentlessly into the Balkans, threatening to puncture the very heart of Christendom. With Bohemia's internal wars concluded, Emperor Sigismund and his successors could finally redirect their full attention, resources, and military manpower to fortifying this external frontier. The Kingdom of Bohemia, with its formidable defensive capabilities and its wealth from silver mines, was transformed from a bleeding wound into a critical eastern bulwark, a shield for the German lands behind it. This reorientation of imperial priorities away from internal religious squabbles and toward a common external enemy created a powerful vacuum of influence in the region, a vacuum that was expertly filled by the ambitious House of Habsburg. Prior to Lipany, the Habsburgs were just one of several powerful dynasties jockeying for position within the complex feudal puzzle of the Holy Roman Empire. But the new stability in Bohemia and the broader containment of the Hussite revolutionary model created a political environment ripe for consolidation. The Habsburgs, with their keen talent for strategic marriage and diplomacy, positioned themselves as the guarantors of this hard-won order. When the Czech nobility eventually offered the Bohemian crown to the Habsburg Ferdinand I in 1526, it was a direct consequence of the post-Lipany political settlement, a preference for a strong, Catholic, external monarch who could ensure stability over the unpredictable turbulence of local factions. This moment did not just give the Habsburgs a new crown, it gave them the economic and strategic foundation of what would become a sprawling, multi-ethnic empire. The silver of Kutná-Hora and the armies of Bohemia would henceforth fuel Habsburg ambitions, making them the dominant power in Central Europe for the next 400 years. Beyond the sheer transfer of power, the political compromise forged in the aftermath of Lipany provided a crucial blueprint for managing the religious strife that would soon tear Europe apart. The Compactata of Basel was a groundbreaking experiment in religious pragmatism. It demonstrated that a major theological schism could be temporarily patched not through total victory, but through negotiated concession, creating a legal framework for coexistence within a single state. This model resonated deeply a century later during the Protestant Reformation, when German princes and Emperor Charles V faced a similar existential crisis. They reached for the same playbook, resulting in the Peace of Augsburg in 1555. The famous principle of cuius regio, ius religio, that the religion of the ruler dictated the religion of his subjects, was a direct intellectual descendant of the Lipany settlement. It was the same concept of a managed territorial compromise, just applied on a larger scale. Lipany proved that religious peace, however uneasy, could be a tool of statecraft, a lesson European rulers would apply for better or worse for generations. However, this political settlement, for all its success in creating stability, came with a profound and lasting cost for the political development of the region. The utter destruction of the Taborite radicals at Lipany represented more than a military defeat. It was the crushing of the most progressive and democratic impulses within Central European society. The Taborites had advocated for concepts that were centuries ahead of their time, a reduction of noble privilege, greater communal governance, and a voice for the common people in matters of faith and, by extension, their own lives. Their annihilation sent a chilling message across the continent that such radical challenges to the established feudal order would be met with overwhelming and decisive force. This successful suppression of populism empowered the nobility and cemented an intensely hierarchical, authoritarian political culture that became a hallmark of Central European empires, particularly the Habsburg monarchy. It effectively delayed the emergence of democratic ideas and popular sovereignty in the region, creating a political trajectory that favored centralized, top-down control from Vienna, a legacy that would shape the region's struggles well into the 20th century. In the grand tapestry of history, the Battle of Lipany thus emerges not as a mere footnote, but as a critical knot where multiple threads of European destiny were tied together. The political stability it imposed allowed for the Habsburg rise. The compromise it engineered offered a template for managing the Reformation, and the suppression it enacted entrenched an authoritarian elite. A single day's combat on a Bohemian field did not just determine the winner of a civil war. It set the stage for the complex, multi-ethnic empire that would dominate the heart of the continent until the cataclysm of the First World War. It is a stunning reminder that the echoes of a forgotten battle can redirect the flow of centuries, proving that history's most pivotal moments are often not the loudest, but the ones that whisper the most profound consequences into the future. But beyond the grand strategies and the sweeping political consequences, the true weight of history is often felt in the silence that follows the battle cry, in the personal reckonings of the ordinary people whose lives were forever altered. To understand Lipany not as an event but as a human experience, we must listen for the voices that have whispered down through the centuries, voices that remind us that every casualty figure was a person, and every strategic victory came at a profound personal cost. Consider the story preserved in a fragile letter from a Utrecht knight, found in a regional archive centuries later. He writes to his wife just days after the fighting, his words not of triumph but of a deep, unsettling sorrow. "We have secured our peace," he scrawls, "but my hand is heavy from the work. In the face of one I struck down, I saw the eyes of a man from Tabor with whom I once shared bread during the siege of Karlstetten. We prayed to the same God for the same freedom, and now I have sent him to meet him. I pray our compact with the Church can forgive what we have done to our own brothers." This is not the voice of a conqueror, but of a man haunted by the intimate horror of civil war, a man who achieved his political goal only to question its spiritual price. From the other side of the social divide, the impact was measured not in guilt, but in cold, hard necessity. The folk songs that emerged from the Bohemian countryside in the years after Lipany are filled with a particular kind of melancholy lament. One, called "The Heavy Yoke," tells the story of a peasant who had fought with the Taborites, believing their victory would mean an end to the oppressive feudal dues owed to the local lord. The song describes his return to his village, not to celebration, but to the arrival of the Lord's bailiff, who presents a revised accounting of all the rents and labor owed for the years of the conflict, now with interest. The chorus repeats, "The field is my own, but the harvest is another's. The victory they won has built my prison stronger." This song gives us a window into the crushing economic reality that followed the ideological defeat. For the common people who had borne the brunt of the fighting, the post-war settlement meant a return to the very hierarchies they had taken up arms to overthrow, a bitter pill that no political compromise could sweeten. Perhaps the most poignant stories are those of survival and transformation, tales of individuals desperately trying to find meaning in the aftermath of shattered beliefs. There is an account passed down through monastic records of a man known only as Brother Merk. Before taking his vows at a monastery in Olomouc, he had been a fervent Taborite foot soldier who fought at Lipany. The chronicle describes how he was left for dead on the field, wounded and unconscious among the corpses of his comrades. He was found by a group of lay brothers from a nearby Catholic monastery who were tasked with burying the dead. Instead of turning him in, they nursed him back to health in secret. The experience of being saved by the very men he had been taught to see as his enemy, and the immense trauma of the battle, completely unraveled his worldview. He could not return to his old life, nor could he cling to his radical past. His only path forward was a complete renunciation of violence, and he eventually joined the same order that had saved him, spending the rest of his days in prayer and tending a medicinal garden. His story is a powerful symbol of the search for peace after violence, a personal pilgrimage from the certainty of zealotry to the humility of grace. These personal narratives, the knight's guilt, the peasant's resignation, the survivor's redemption, do more than just add emotional color to the historical record. They anchor the vast, abstract forces of politics, religion, and economics to the tangible experiences of fear, hope, and loss. They remind us that the balance of power in Europe was not shifted by faceless armies, but by individual men and women who made terrible choices, endured unimaginable hardships, and carried the scars of that day for the rest of their lives. When we hear these voices from the battlefield, history ceases to be a dry timeline and becomes a deeply human drama, making the forgotten Battle of Lipany not just a subject of study, but a story we can feel. If we were to gather a dozen historians in a room and ask them to explain the true meaning of the Battle of Lipany, we would likely end up with 13 fiercely argued interpretations. This is because history is never a single, settled story. It is a living conversation, a constant reassessment of the past through the lens of the present. The way scholars have viewed Lipany over the centuries tells us as much about their own times as it does about the events of 1434, revealing how our deepest values and beliefs shape the stories we tell about who we were. The clash on that Bohemian field serves as a perfect case study in this ongoing debate, a single event refracted through multiple, competing ideological prisms. The most long-standing and traditional interpretation frames Lipany as a painful but necessary tragedy. In this view, the moderate Utraquists were pragmatic realists who made the only choice that could save the Czech nation from total self-destruction after 15 exhausting years of war. Proponents of this perspective argue that the radical Taborites, for all their admirable idealism, had become an obstacle to peace. Their refusal to accept any compromise with the Catholic Church or the Emperor would have guaranteed the continued devastation of Bohemia, leaving it a weakened and vulnerable target for its foreign enemies. The battle, therefore, was a terrible but essential surgery, the amputation of a gangrenous limb to save the body of the nation. This view often carries a tone of sorrowful resignation, seeing Divish Borek not as a traitor but as a tragic hero forced to make an unbearable choice for the greater good. As the esteemed Czech historian František Smahol has suggested, the Utraquist leaders were navigating a path of calculated sacrifice, believing that the blood spilled at Lipany would ultimately save far more lives by bringing a definitive end to the conflict. In direct opposition to this traditional view, a powerful revisionist interpretation emerged in the 20th century, particularly among nationalist and liberal historians. This school of thought sees Lipany not as a necessary evil, but as a profound betrayal, a cynical coup d'état orchestrated by the noble elite against their own revolutionary allies. From this perspective, the moderate Utraquist nobility never truly shared the radical social and economic goals of the Taborite peasants and townspeople. They had joined the revolution to curb the power of the church and the emperor, goals which they largely achieved through the Compactata. The radicals, however, wanted to go much further, challenging the very foundations of feudal privilege and noble authority. The revisionists argue that the nobles realized a continued alliance with the radicals was far more dangerous to their own power than a negotiated peace with the Catholic emperor. Therefore, Lipany was a deliberate act of class preservation, where the elite crushed the populist wing of their own movement to secure a peace that benefited their own status and property. The battle wasn't about saving Bohemia. It was about saving the nobility's place at the top of Bohemian society. Adding another sharp layer of analysis, the Marxist interpretation, which was particularly influential during the communist era in Czechoslovakia, wholeheartedly embraces this idea of class conflict but frames it in even starker economic terms. For Marxist historians, the Hussite Revolution was fundamentally a class war, an early bourgeois uprising against feudal oppression with a strong undercurrent of proto-communist peasant aspiration. The Taborites, in this view, represented the revolutionary vanguard of the oppressed classes, fighting for a utopian society free from feudal exploitation. The Battle of Lipany, then, is the classic historical moment where the bourgeois moderates, the Utraquist nobility, and wealthy burghers got cold feet. Once they had secured their own economic and religious concessions, they turned against their more radical working-class allies to prevent the revolution from moving into a more dangerous, socially transformative phase. It was a counter-revolution within the revolution, where the rising bourgeois class made common cause with the remnants of the feudal order to crush the genuine threat of peasant communism. The American historian Howard Kaminsky, while not strictly Marxist, captured this dynamic when he wrote that the Hussite Revolution saw the first great clash between the program of a radical reformation and the conservative instincts of a society still deeply feudal. Lipany was the moment those conservative instincts won violently. These competing perspectives show us that there is no single objective truth waiting to be uncovered in the archives. The evidence, the chronicles, the letters, the archaeological finds remains the same, but the framework we use to assemble it changes dramatically based on the questions we ask. A traditionalist asks what was necessary for survival, a revisionist asks who betrayed whom, a Marxist asks which class benefited. Each line of inquiry reveals a different facet of the same complex event. This doesn't mean that history is just opinion. It means that rigorous history requires an awareness of our own biases and the ideological currents of our time. We are always in a dialogue with the past, and the answers we receive depend greatly on the questions we bring with us. The Battle of Lipany endures as a subject of fierce debate precisely because it forces us to confront these difficult questions about power, idealism, and the price of peace, questions that remain just as urgent and unanswerable today as they were nearly 600 years ago. While the thunder of cannon and the clash of steel at Lipany may have faded from the earth, its echoes have found a curious, if muted, afterlife in the realm of stories and screens. To search for the battle in global popular culture is to hunt for a ghost. It is a name that draws blank stares where the Battle of Agincourt or the Siege of Troy conjure immediate, vivid imagery. Yet, in its native Bohemia, the story has never fully been allowed to die. The great 19th-century Czech writer Lech Jurasik, a towering figure of the national revival, wove the tragedy of Lipany into the fabric of his monumental historical novel, Against All. For Jurasik, writing at a time when the Czech people were seeking to reclaim their history from German-dominated narratives, the battle was not a simple tale of heroes and villains. Instead, he portrayed it with a profound Shakespearean complexity, a necessary national tragedy where the flawed, pragmatic moderates were forced to destroy the pure, doomed radicals to ensure the very survival of the Czech nation. This ambivalent treatment cemented Lipany's place in the Czech consciousness not as a glorious victory to be celebrated, but as a painful, foundational wound to be remembered and pondered. Venture beyond the borders of the Czech Republic, however, and you will find a cultural silence that is itself deeply revealing. Why does a clash like Agincourt, fought just 19 years earlier, loom so large in the English-speaking world? The reasons have little to do with historical impact and everything to do with narrative appeal. Agincourt offers a clean, compelling story. The brave, outnumbered English longbowmen under a charismatic king defeating the arrogant, heavily armored French nobility. It's a perfect underdog story, easily mythologized and packaged. Lipany, by contrast, is a messy, morally ambiguous civil war. It lacks a clear foreign villain and a simple moral. It is a story of brother against brother, of idealism shattered by pragmatism, of a victory that feels like a loss. These are complex, uncomfortable themes that resist the kind of heroic simplification that fuels blockbuster films and epic miniseries. A global audience, largely unfamiliar with the nuances of Hussite theology, would likely find the internal conflict confusing, making it a less attractive subject for mass-market producers seeking easily digestible drama. The one modern medium where Lipany and its era have begun to find a surprising foothold is in the expansive world of video games. The strategy game Medieval Roman II: Total War features a dedicated expansion, the Teutonic Campaign, which includes the Hussites as a playable faction. Here, players can command the infamous war wagons, recreating the tactical innovations that made the Hussites so formidable. More recently, the critically acclaimed game Kingdom Come: Deliverance, set in early 15th century Bohemia, immerses players in the world of the Hussite Wars, even if it doesn't depict Lipany directly. Through its meticulous attention to historical detail, the landscapes, the armor, the social tensions, the game conveys the atmosphere of the era that made the battle inevitable. This interactive engagement is powerful. It allows millions of players worldwide to engage with this history not as passive readers, but as active participants, fostering a visceral understanding of Hussite tactics and the era's conflict that a textbook simply cannot provide. This stark contrast in cultural representation forces a rather uncomfortable question about the very nature of history itself. The battles and figures that dominate our popular culture are not necessarily the most important, but rather the ones that best fit a pre-existing national mythos or a simple, marketable narrative. A society's popular memory is a curated collection, a selective narrative that emphasizes certain events while allowing others, like Lipany, to recede into the shadows. We remember what reinforces our identity and forget what complicates it. The English remember Agincourt as a moment of national glory. The Czechs remember Lipany as a moment of painful, necessary compromise. The rest of the world, for the most part, remembers neither, because their stories don't easily serve a broader, global myth-making purpose. This cultural filtering is not a passive process. It is an active, though often unconscious, choice. And in making that choice, we risk constructing an understanding of the past that is not just incomplete, but fundamentally distorted. If our view of history is shaped primarily by the tales that make for the simplest and most exciting stories, we are left with a past populated by clear-cut heroes and villains, devoid of the tragic complexity, the difficult compromises, and the sober lessons that often characterize the moments that truly change the world. To forget a battle like Lipany is to forget that history is often a gray, complicated, and deeply human affair, and in doing so, we may lose the ability to understand the very same forces shaping our world today. The story of Lipany is not a dusty relic confined to the past. It is a mirror reflecting the very dilemmas that define our modern world. At its heart, the battle was a brutal collision between two irreconcilable forces that still shape our political and social landscapes: the uncompromising purity of idealism and the difficult, often messy, art of pragmatism. We see this tension play out every day in movements for climate action, social justice, and political reform. On one side are the idealists, the modern Taborites, who argue that the system is fundamentally broken and that only radical, immediate transformation can avert catastrophe. They demand nothing less than a total overhaul, viewing incremental steps as a betrayal of the cause itself. Their moral clarity is their strength, a burning passion that inspires and mobilizes. Yet, this very purity can also be a strategic weakness, alienating potential allies in the broader public who may be sympathetic to the goals but are frightened by the methods or the scale of the demanded change. Conversely, the pragmatists, the contemporary utraquists, operate from a different playbook. They believe that to make any progress at all, you must first secure a seat at the table, even if it means negotiating with those you distrust. Their strategy is one of incremental gains, of building coalitions, of accepting half a loaf today in the hope of securing the rest tomorrow. They argue that a movement that cannot win elections, pass legislation, or influence policy is a movement that ultimately fails, no matter how morally righteous its stance. The Compactata of Basel is their model, a tangible, if imperfect, achievement that moves the needle and provides a foundation to build upon. The danger for them, as it was for Divish Borek, is the accusation of selling out, of becoming so focused on the art of the possible that they lose sight of the ultimate goal, gradually diluting their principles until the original vision is unrecognizable. This internal conflict between radicals and moderates is often a far greater threat to a movement's success than any external opposition. A unified front, even a diverse one, is a powerful force. But a movement publicly tearing itself apart over strategy and purity is a gift to its adversaries, who can simply stand back and watch as their opponents do the work of dismantling themselves. The environmental movement provides a stark, current example of this Lipany dynamic. For decades, the broad goal of combating climate change has been hampered by the very same fracture. On one flank, there are groups and individuals advocating for direct, disruptive action, occupying pipelines, organizing global school strikes, and calling for the immediate dismantling of the fossil fuel economy. Their urgency is born from the terrifying science, and their methods are designed to shock the world out of its complacency. On the other flank are the policy experts, the lobbyists, and the large NGOs working within the system to craft carbon tax legislation, negotiate international agreements like the Paris Accords, and develop green technology incentives. Each side views the other with deep suspicion. The radicals may see the moderates as captured by corporate interests, offering solutions that are too little, too late. The moderates may view the radicals as unrealistic provocateurs whose actions alienate the political center and make bipartisan legislation impossible. The lesson from Lipany is not that one side is right and the other is wrong, but that this internal strife, if left unmanaged, can be absolutely fatal. Victory often requires a delicate and conscious balancing act, a recognition that both the radical wing and the moderate wing play essential, though different, roles. The radicals set the outer boundaries of the debate, pulling the center of gravity toward more ambitious goals and making the moderates' proposals seem reasonable by comparison. The moderates, in turn, work to translate that energy into durable, real-world change that can improve lives and build a sustainable political consensus. A movement that silences its idealists risks losing its soul and its driving passion. A movement that fails to empower its pragmatists risks never turning its passion into power. The true strategic genius lies in finding a way for these two forces to work in tandem, even if in tension, rather than turning their weapons on each other. The tragedy of Lipany is that this tension escalated into open warfare, ensuring that no one's goals were fully achieved and that the ultimate victors were those waiting on the sidelines for the revolution to consume itself. The battle's enduring legacy is a cautionary tale about the long-term cost of victory, reminding us that how you win and what you are willing to sacrifice to get there can determine the world you are left to build long after the fighting is done. Perhaps the most profound reason for Lipany's disappearance from popular memory lies in its deeply ambiguous outcome. This was not a simple, glorious victory of good over evil that could be easily packaged into a national myth. It was a tragic, fratricidal conflict where the victors were forced to slaughter their former comrades to achieve a peace that felt, to many, like a surrender of their most cherished ideals. How do you build a patriotic monument to that national myth-making thrives on clear narratives, heroic last stands against foreign invaders, like the Battle of the White Mountain in 1620, or defiant victories against impossible odds? Lipany offers none of that clarity. It is a story of compromise, of moral gray areas, of a victory that required a nation to break its own heart. Such complex, uncomfortable truths are often the first to be swept aside in favor of simpler, more inspiring tales that can unite a people around a common, proud identity. The battle was simply too painful, too psychologically complicated, to fit into the neat stories we prefer to tell ourselves about who we are and where we come from. This intentional shaping of memory is not a passive process. It is an active, often political, act of erasure. For centuries after the battle, the dominant historical narrative in Europe was written by the victors of a different conflict, the Catholic Church and the Habsburg monarchy. Their chroniclers had every incentive to downplay the entire Hussite period. To glorify the Hussites, even the moderate Utraquists, would be to legitimize a successful challenge to church authority. It was far safer to minimize their achievements, to paint the entire era as a period of chaotic heresy that was justly subdued, and to focus historical attention on less troublesome subjects. The battle that ensured the Church's diplomatic victory was conveniently forgotten because remembering it would mean acknowledging the power and legitimacy of the heretics they had to negotiate with. This was not an oversight. It was a deliberate strategy to control the past in order to secure the present. Later, when Czech nationalists in the 19th century began excavating their history to build a case for independence from the Habsburg Empire, they too found Lipany to be an awkward foundation stone. The national revival needed uncomplicated heroes and unambiguous moments of pride to fuel its movement. They naturally gravitated towards the early, defiant years of the Hussite Revolution, the brilliant generalship of Jan Žižka, the stunning victories against the Crusaders, the radical democratic spirit of Tabor. These were episodes that could stir the blood and inspire a nation. Lipany, by contrast, was the moment that spirit was broken by Czech hands. It was a chapter that spoke of internal division and pragmatic surrender, not unified defiance. Why focus on a civil war when you could celebrate a war of liberation? The nationalists chose to remember the glorious beginning of the Hussite saga, not its messy, ambiguous conclusion, effectively sidelining Lipany from the central narrative of Czech identity. The single greatest force in erasing Lipany, however, was the sheer cataclysmic power of the event that followed it. The 30 Years' War, which began in 1618, was a continent-wide catastrophe of such immense scale and horror that it simply overwrote the memory of the earlier conflict. Where the Hussite Wars were a foundational, internal Czech story, the 30 Years' War was a European tragedy that reshaped the entire political and religious map of the continent. It laid waste to entire regions of Bohemia, decimated its population, and led to the loss of Czech independence for nearly 300 years under the oppressive Habsburg counter-reformation. The trauma was so vast, so all-consuming, that the earlier struggle between Utraquists and Taborites began to seem like a minor, almost provincial family quarrel by comparison. A battle that ended a revolution was inevitably overshadowed by a war that ended a kingdom and defined an era. This phenomenon of historical overshadowing is not unique to Lipany. We see it all the time. The Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260, where the Mamluks halted the Mongol advance into the Middle East, is world historically significant yet remains far less famous than the earlier Mongol victories it contained. Its complex aftermath doesn't fit a simple narrative as neatly as the story of unstoppable conquest. Similarly, the Battle of Warsaw in 1920, which halted the Bolshevik advance into Europe, is often overlooked in the West because it was soon eclipsed by the larger narrative of World War II and the Cold War. Events are forgotten when they become inconvenient to the stories that later generations need to tell. We remember what fits our current identity and forget what complicates it. The recovery of a battle like Lipany is therefore more than an academic exercise. It is an act of challenging the very notion that history belongs only to the winners and their simple stories. It is an insistence on embracing the full, messy, contradictory complexity of the past, because it is often in those uncomfortable ambiguities that we find the most profound truths about ourselves. We rarely consider the silent, unintended casualty of history's great clashes, the very land upon which they are fought. While chroniclers meticulously recorded the movements of armies and the speeches of kings, they paid little mind to the trampled crops, the denuded forests, or the scarred earth left in the wake of thousands of soldiers. The environmental impact of the Battle of Lipany, like that of most medieval conflicts, remains a story told not in words but in soil samples, pollen records, and the silent testimony of the landscape itself. To understand the full cost of that day, we must look beyond the human drama and consider the ecological ledger, a hidden dimension that adds profound depth to our understanding of how war reshapes a world. Consider first the most tangible resource consumed by the Hussite war machine: wood. The Revolutionary War wagons that defined their military success were not ethereal concepts. They were physical objects, heavy and robust, constructed from enormous quantities of timber. Historical estimates suggest that a single, well-made war wagon required the wood of several mature oak or beech trees. Multiply that by the hundreds of wagons fielded by both sides at Lipany, and then factor in the countless more built, damaged, and replaced over 15 years of continuous warfare, and the scale of deforestation becomes staggering. The forests surrounding Hussite strongholds like Tabor and Prague would have been systematically harvested, not just for wagons but for fortifications, palisades, and the endless need for firewood in military camps. This wasn't a sustainable logging operation. It was a rapid, localized stripping of resources for immediate survival, leaving behind patches of barren ground susceptible to erosion and fundamentally altering local ecosystems for generations. The impact of the battle itself, concentrated on a single day, was a violent shock to a specific ecosystem. The movement of over 20,000 men, along with thousands of horses and draft animals, across the fields near Lipany would have been an act of profound terrestrial violence. The weight of men in armor and heavy wooden wagons churned the fertile topsoil into a quagmire, especially if the spring weather had been wet. This compaction destroys the delicate structure of the soil, crushing the networks of fungi and microbes essential for nutrient exchange and making it incredibly difficult for vegetation to re-establish itself. The hooves of cavalry horses and the boots of infantry would have ripped through any young crops in the area, while the establishment of camps and the digging of latrines would have introduced waste and disrupted water tables. For the local farmers, the battlefield was not a place of historical significance. It was a ruined field that would require years of backbreaking labor to restore to productivity, a personal economic disaster in the wake of a national political one. The aftermath of the battle and the broader pacification of Bohemia triggered a different kind of environmental response, a long, slow recovery. With the war finally over, the immense pressure on the region's forests and fields began to ease. The constant demand for timber for war wagons and siege engines ceased almost overnight. This reprieve likely allowed many wooded areas to begin a process of natural regeneration. Furthermore, the political stability achieved by the Utrecht victory enabled a more organized management of resources. There is evidence in land records from the following decades of deliberate reforestation efforts, particularly on lands now controlled by the victorious nobility. Planting trees was not merely an ecological act, it was an economic one, a long-term investment in valuable timber resources, and a reassertion of controlled, feudal order over a landscape that had been wild and contested for so long. The forest, once cleared for war, was now being replanted for peace and profit. This holistic view forces us to expand our definition of a battle's consequences. The Battle of Lipany did not just change the balance of power in Europe, it changed the physical balance of the Bohemian landscape. It altered the composition of its forests, the health of its soil, and the management of its waterways. The choices made by generals on that day echoed not only through the halls of power in Prague and Basel, but through the very ecosystems that supported life in the region. It reminds us that history and the environment are inextricably linked, that every political decision and military campaign has an ecological footprint. To ignore this dimension is to tell only half the story. The true legacy of a battle is written not just in treaties and chronicles, but in the growth rings of the trees that eventually reclaim the field, a silent, living monument to the Earth's resilience in the face of humanity's endless conflicts. So as the dust settled on that field near Lipany, what truly remained? We've traced the arc of this forgotten battle from its fiery origins in the Hussite Revolution to its chilling aftermath, and the picture that emerges is one of profound and painful complexity. The Battle of Lipany was far more than a simple military engagement. It was a brutal pivot point that fundamentally altered the trajectory of a continent. It extinguished the most radical religious revolution of its time, bringing a sudden and violent end to 15 years of war, but in doing so, it snuffed out a fiery dream of a more egalitarian world. It stabilized a fractured Bohemia, allowing for economic recovery and a return to order, but that stability was purchased by reimposing the very feudal hierarchies that the revolution had sought to overthrow. And perhaps most significantly, it quietly reshaped the European balance of power for centuries, creating a stable eastern flank for the Holy Roman Empire that allowed the House of Habsburg to rise and eventually dominate Central Europe. The lessons whispered from this distant field are not just about dates and tactics. They are timeless human lessons about the difficult dance between idealism and pragmatism. Lipany forces us to ask the hardest of questions. When does standing firm on principle become a dangerous inflexibility that leads to ruin? And when does the pragmatic compromise for survival become a betrayal of everything you once fought for? There are no easy answers here, only the sobering recognition that history is rarely a story of clear-cut heroes and villains, but more often a tragedy of conflicting rights, where both sides truly believe they are saving their cause from destruction. The story of Lipany is a masterclass in the unpredictability of history itself, showing us that the most decisive turning points are not always the famous, celebrated battles, but sometimes the quiet, forgotten ones where the future is chosen in a moment of terrible, necessary violence. This is why the work of uncovering these hidden stories is so vital. The philosopher George Santayana famously warned that those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it, and Lipany stands as a stark monument to that truth. When we allow such pivotal moments to fade from our collective memory, we lose crucial understanding of the forces that shape our world, the power of ideology, the danger of internal division, and the long, often hidden consequences of compromise. By pulling Lipany back from the shadows, we do more than just correct a historical record. We enrich our grasp of the human condition, gaining a deeper, more nuanced appreciation for the complex tapestry of cause and effect that binds our present to their past. Now we want to hear from you. This journey into a forgotten corner of history is just one of many. What other overlooked battles do you believe secretly shaped the world? Was there a clash in your own country's history that everyone has forgotten, but that you think changed everything? Share your thoughts and suggestions down in the comments below. We read every single one, and they truly help guide our future deep dives. If you enjoyed unraveling this mystery with us and want to explore more stories lost to time, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss what's coming next. We have a whole playlist dedicated to history's most pivotal but overlooked events, and we'll see you in the next video. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into one of history's most pivotal yet overlooked moments. If you found the story of the Battle of Lipany as fascinating as we do, you can really help us out by giving this video a like and sharing it with someone else who loves to uncover the past's hidden secrets. It makes a huge difference in helping these forgotten stories find the audience they deserve. Make sure you're subscribed to the channel and have that notification bell turned on so you don't miss our next exploration into history's greatest mysteries. We've got so many more incredible stories just like this one coming your way. If you're hungry for more right now, we've put together an entire playlist dedicated to history's most pivotal but overlooked events, all waiting for you to discover. For those of you who love to dig into the sources yourselves, we've included a list of all the books and papers we consulted in the video description below. Now we want to hear from you. This journey into a forgotten corner of history is just one of many. What other overlooked battles do you believe secretly shaped the world? Was there a clash in your own country's history that everyone has forgotten, but that you think changed everything? Let us know down in the comments. We read every single one, and they truly help guide our future deep dives.